Good evening, everyone. Welcome you all for this UOH History webinar series 14. Today we have very distinguished scholar, Professor Prathama Banerjee from CSDS, New Delhi. So she today will be speaking on kings, jurists, ascetics, discontinuous histories of sovereignty in India. Of course, she is well known among the academic circle. But just for sake of formal introduction, I request my colleague Dr. Vijay Ramdas to introduce Prathama formally. Over to you, Vijay.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bangia. Um, um, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. This is a kind of usual acknowledgement of the scholarship of Professor Prathama Banerjee. We are delighted to have Professor Prathama Banerjee. Professor Prathama Banerjee is a historian trained at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, then School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Currently, she is a professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi. Professor Banerjee is the author of two books. One is titled Politics of Time, Primitive and History Writing in a Colonial Society, published by Oxford University Press in 2006. Her forthcoming book titled Elementary Aspects of Political Histories from the Global South will be published by Duke University Press this year. Uh, Professor Banerjee's research interests lie in the history of ideals, cultural history, literary studies, and increasingly contemporary democracy. Professor Banerjee's current work is on histories of political in colonial and post-colonial India. Her work seeks to tell the story of how the political emerged as a distinct domain and or mode of thought, action, and subjectivity in modern times. Uh, uh, Professor Banerjee's work, The Politics of Time, published by OUP, explores the emergence of the modern discipline of history in colonial Bengal from an encounter with people without history. That is, tribes, or other way of calling tribes is Adivasis, Aborigines, primitives, something which falls under Professor Bangyas as well as my discipline of research interest, as they were variously called. So she mapped this encounter in different discursive and material sites, such as that of calendrical reforms, history and geography texts, anthropology, poetry, indentured labor markets, agrarian credit markets, and so on. So this is something subaltern variety of history. That is, people without history, something Professor Banerjee published in the book titled Politics of Time. So coming to today's talk titled Kings, Jurists, Ascetics, Outcast, Discontinuous Histories of Sovereignty in India. Professor Banerjee will navigate through the trajectory of past and ask, what does a deep history of sovereignty look like in this part of the world? So here she offers a contention in today's talk. She will then suggest that the concept of sovereignty as it evolved in medieval and early modern Europe and subsequently globalized via the work of colonialism and nationalism does not quite capture the diverse and dispersed regimes of rule that South Asia experienced through the centuries. So she rejects the concept of sovereignty coming from globalized network of colonialism and nationalism. So in today's talk, Professor Banerjee proposes that in South Asia or the Indian subcontinent, regimes of rule were constituted by an irresolvable dialectic between political power and social power. She connects between nexus between political power and social power in order to understand sovereignty throughout histories in South Asia. King and Brahmin, Sultan and Sharia, state law and caste or community law, in a way that unsettles or problematizes the classic definition of sovereignty as the exclusive right of the ruler to institute and suspend law. So we will have more interesting details concerning today's talk. Over to you, Professor Prathama Banerjee.
Yeah, Prathama, you can take something about 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then we'll go for discussion. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very kind invitation. Thank you, Bhangya, Varghese, Anindita. Some of them are already old friends, some of whom I already know but never met formally. And I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation today. So I'll just launch into it straight away. So in this presentation, I look back as a historian of modern times into the far past to explore the nature of rulership in South Asia. For analytical purposes, I peg my inquiry to the by now global concept of sovereignty, which we imagine as an attribute of the state, with its assumed monopoly of law and violence, and its defining prerogative of absolute freedom of policy and practice. Now, sovereignty is a concept with a medieval and early modern European provenance. It has a specific philosophical constitution having to do with the ruler's prerogative to institute law, declare exception, and dispense debt. In the European academy, the debate about the historicity of sovereign power continues to rage amongst highly influential philosophers. I shall not restate here the well-known historicist argument against sovereignty, namely that sovereignty is a pre-modern political formation superseded in modernity by other forms of governance, such as discipline and biopolitics. But nor shall I make the anti-historicist argument, which sees modern governmentality as always shot through with archaic forms of sacrificial and sovereign violence. It is not that I disagree with these arguments, but for the moment, I want to step outside the terms of this debate and make a different proposition. My proposition is that the term sovereignty does not quite capture the nature of political power in South Asia, and most likely in many other parts of the world. In South Asia, the colonial state deployed the concept in the 19th century, and in the name of the rule of law, governed the colonized through acts of exception and emergency, performing the classical model of sovereignty, as it were. With independence, states inherited the rhetoric of national sovereignty, in time naturalizing the concept across the world. If one looks back into history, however, it becomes clear that in South Asia, neither the state nor law were sovereign entities in the strict sense of the term. Historians of South Asia have registered this fact. They have debated whether other conceptual formulations, such as segmentary state, shared sovereignty, little kingdom, galactic polity, etc., work better to describe the dispersed and distributed nature of political power in South Asian history, given that here the substance and quality of kingship, even in times of imperial majesty, was shared between the paramount ruler and multiple other forms of landholding and self-governing entities, monasteries, temples, gods, Brahmins, guilds, clans, tribes, zamindars, and so on. Stateness, in other words, was not a transcendental form of power. Historians have also noted that in South Asia, the state was not the primary source of law. Law pre-existed the state. While the state was expected to dispense justice and punishment, it did so by a discriminatory application along with the king's decree of community law, caste law, regional custom, doctrinal criteria, and normative principles such as of reasonableness and fair play. State and law, in other words, did not form a tightly knit conceptual pair as is implied by the concept of sovereignty. And yet, we continue to use sovereignty as a generic term for political regimes everywhere. Our point of departure remains the early modern absolutist state of Europe, an ideality which we qualify post facto by bringing into play empirical modifications, whence our vocabulary of shared, segmentary, theatrical, ritual, concentric, or for more recent times, incomplete and even failed sovereignty. Or in the name of social history, that is the history of caste, class, race, gender, and religion, we focus on the apparently symmetrical other of the state, namely society, often to the deliberate exclusion of state and government, discounting, for example, the fact that in South Asia, a deep history of caste cannot be written without accounting for the phenomena of low caste kingships and untouchable warrior communities. Either way, we unwittingly end up reinforcing the state versus society and the social versus political binary of modern political thought that obscures, I believe, the actual operation of power in the long history of South Asia. So my proposition today is that in South Asia, regimes of rule, and I deliberately use the phrase regimes of rule as a substitute for the default term state, were constituted by an irresolute dialectic between political power and social power, king and Brahmin, sultan and Sharia, state law and caste or community law, in a way that unsettles the classical definition of sovereignty as the exclusive right of the ruler to institute and suspend law. To understand the dynamic of political power here, therefore, we must attend to the social constitution as much as to the state and see the king as one of the actors who partakes in as well as cuts through pre-existing social dynamics. I should clarify right away that when I use the term society, for the lack of any other available term in English, I imply samaj, a term found in both Sanskrit and many of the vernaculars, which I take to mean the horizon of possibility of sociability, and not a nation or a population unified, territorialized, and governmentalized by a state. In other words, the term social for me for purposes of this paper, does not denote the society of the modern state versus society, political versus social binary. The South Asian social constitution, or Samaj, as we know, seeks to order individuals and communities into an eternal hierarchy of varnas, scholars, warriors, producers, and servants. This normative hierarchy is in turn deployed to legislate upon the empirical diversity of jatis, that is, occupational and birth groups, in terms of A, parameters of mutual proximity and distance, B, permissible forms of and degrees of sociability, and C, relative position vis-a-vis the boundary between society and those like forest peoples, untouchables, ascetics, foreigners, etc., who are seen as beyond the pale of society, variously called mlecha, vratya, antyavasi, and so on. Dharma, as elaborated in the textual genre of the Dharma Shastras, was thus a paradigm of diminishing political autonomy backed by social strictures, with the Brahmin at the top claiming immunity from taxes, capital punishment, and confiscation of property, almost a sovereign unto himself, and the Shudra at the bottom relegated to servitude and by definition a non-sovereign. In other words, the social constitution was imagined as an existential range bracketed between the limit conditions of absolute freedom on the one hand and bondage and servitude on the other, with various jatis ascribed differential exposure to law, punishment, and violence. The Dharma Shastras explained the empirical diversity of jatis as being the result of caste miscegenation, theoretically instituting the principle that the social order was a regime of degrees of permissible and prohibited sociability, involving the entire possible range of human interactivities, touch, sight, commensality, and sex, and enforced by an elaborate jurisprudence of punishment, penance, and excommunication. In this framework, dharma was indeed law, but law immanent to society, with the king written into it as yet another social being, even though a preeminent one, subject to Kshatriya dharma and socially assigned rights and duties, of which the most important in Brahmanical telling was, of course, the enforcement of varna and jati sociability. Now, Ambedkar pointed this out in early 20th century in criticism of nationalists who valorized Indian society as the sovereign domain of national life and opposed colonial laws, not in terms of a particular law's merits and demerits, but in terms of the colonial state's foreignness to Indian society. Ambedkar famously said that India was never a society in the first place, even if it might have been politically and culturally a nation. India was an agglomeration of castes and communities which operated like polities unto themselves, policing their borders and prohibiting intercaste and intercommunity sociability. Samaj, in other words, was a juridicalized formation, and proscription and punishment, often involving violence, was a socially dispersed and socially contested prerogative. Needless to say, this historical reading of Samaj troubles the concept of sovereignty as a transcendent form of political and juridical power, ascribable exclusively to the state. Following Ambedkar's formulation, I argue in this presentation that political power in South Asia was historically locked into an infinite dialectic without resolution or sublation, with a fundamentally juridicalized and potentially totalizing social constitution. Now, the semantic history of the term Dharma, as told by the Indologist Patrick Olivelle, is rather interesting. In the earliest texts available, such as the Vedas and the Brahmanas, Dharma was invoked purely in association with royal power, both kingly and godly, Dharma being that which protected the weak from the strong. Eventually, however, Dharma began to be claimed and consolidated as the domain of the Brahmin, the classifier and the legislator of society. This process, we already know, was contemporaneous with the rise of ascetic philosophies in various parts of South Asia. Asceticism anti-Brahmanical, though not always anti-caste, rhetoric, and fed into the possibility of an autonomous and ascendant kingship, no longer dependent on the Brahmins' intercession with the gods via the mediation of the sacrifice. Not surprisingly, the Maurya kings, Shudras by Brahmanical reckoning, and the Sakas and the Kushana rulers hailing from Central Asia and known as foreigners or lepchas, turned to Buddhism as royal ideology. The king-Brahmin pact around the institution of sacrifice thus began to unravel. This led to a long history, of what has been called Brahmanical reaction, which even as it tried to incorporate elements of the ascetic disposition into the persona of the ideal Brahmin, produced virulent rhetoric against wandering ascetics. The more obviously Brahmanical and interpolated sections of the Arthashastra, for example, exhorted the king to prevent ascetics from settling in the kingdom because they incited secession and rebellion. Now, Dharmashastras and commentaries on Dharmashastras proliferated and systematized over the centuries, consolidating the Brahmanical social constitution and on rare occasions leading actually to the direct deployment of Varna and Jati Dharma as royal ideology, as happened in the Maratha Peshwa regime of the 18th century, with an intention to making the political dispensation and the social constitution perfectly identical. Eventually, inter-community relationships would also be managed in the same Dharmashastric terms. Kumkum Chatterjee, for example, shows how in Bengal, Brahmins tightened controls on marriage, and purified lineage histories around the 14th century to firm up the social boundary against the new Muslim ruling elite, even as they vied for Muslim patronage and eventually acquired a Persianate courtly culture in their public life. Needless to say, the consolidation of the Dharmashastric social constitution did not go unchallenged. Its most trenchant critique came in the form of what I call here, albeit rather provocatively, the anti-social perspective. And this is my main proposition in today's paper. I use the term anti-social to denote an individual or a community's self-presentation as being outside the pale of society. And by virtue of precisely that externality, a source of counter-Brahmanical power and sovereign freedom. Understood in this way, the antisocial becomes a capacious and complex heuristic category and can include diverse historical modes of being, of which, of course, the ascetic was the exemplar. Now, Brahmanical suspicion was not only reserved for Buddhist and Jain ascetics, but also extended to myriad others who we would today think of as belonging to the internal history of Hinduism. Manu Devadevan, in his book, The Prehistory of Hinduism, speaks of numerous ascetics and saints emerging from low-caste service people and dispossessed peasants in southern India from the 13th to well into the 19th century. The condition of unfreedom, aggressive slavery, bonded labor, and village servitude that kept so-called low castes and outcasts irreversibly tied to the social constitution was clearly an incentive to seeking out an antisocial and secessionist freedom of an ascetic or a wandering mendicant, both Vaishnava and Shaiva in orientation. In fact, Shaivism is a particularly useful tradition to think with because it had various recalcitrant strands within it, of which the example of the Kapalikas is the most telling. Kapalikas, or skull men, worshipped the antisocial and ascetic god Shiva, who lived atop Mount Kailash, far from human habitation, and socialized with ghosts, snakes, and bulls. The Kapalikas identified themselves by their begging bowls made out of human skulls, ash-smeared bodies, and propensity to frequent cremation grounds and other frontier spaces. David Lorenzen points out that an early Dharmashastric text, the Yagyabalka Smriti, used the term Kapalika to denote Brahmin killers. In later texts, Kapalikas were mentioned as those who demonstrated to the great Shankaracharya, the founder of Advaita Vedanta, the aporia of his existential thinking, caught as it was in an irresolute double bind between action and inaction, dualism and non-dualism. Gorakha Siddha Siddhanta, the founding text of the Nathapanthis, Recently in news, as you know, because the ultra-Hindu Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath claims to belong to this community, stated, quoting from Savaratantra, that Kapalikas cut off the heads of the avatars of Lord Vishnu to rid them of their pride and carried their skulls in their hands. The Nath yogis were adepts, and many of them hailed from low caste and untouchable communities, as evinced by the names of many siddhas, including Tombi, Sabri, Tanti, Chamari, and so on and so forth. I cite the example of the Kapalikas in order to try and capture the precise texture of what I am calling here the antisocial perspective, animated by troubling symbols like human skulls, dangerous spaces such as cremation grounds, waste dumps, forests, and physical exclusion, untouchables, ascetics, tribals. Now, the antisocial in this telling is not a liminal perspective in any generic sense. It is a very particular orientation produced out of the constitutive aporia of the South Asian social constitution. The philosopher Sundar Sarukkai, in his essay, The Phenomenology of Untouchability, writes of the community of Acharyas, the most superior of all Brahmins, who fashioned themselves as untouchables, whose leftovers not even a dog can eat because it is poison to others. The absolute superiority of the Acharyas, in other words, is understood as a function of their absolute unsociability. I understand this counterintuitive case of social being, the untouchable Brahmin, as a limit case, which exposes the constitutive aporia of Dharma. The aporia being that Dharma is an imagination of society founded on the principle of unsociability. It is this aporia that produces, I believe, the antisocial as a potentially powerful counter perspective in the history of political power in South Asia. Now, apart from the exemplary ascetic, the category of the antisocial could include at various times armed warrior monks, heterodox devotional communities, atavikas or forest peoples, amongst whom kingships emerged, such as among the Bhils of central India, the Gajapatis of Orissa, or indeed the famous Nayakas of southern India, who hailed originally from the hunter and shepherd castes. The antisocial as a category would also include the Mleccha Muslim ruler, the Sufi, Pir and Ghazi, and of course, above all, the Antyavasi, literally the dweller of the edges, mostly denoting untouchables and outcasts, who are seen to frequent dangerous spaces outside the border of settlements. Now, much can be said about how each of these diverse antisocial locations produced distinctive political and existential counter-discourses to hegemonic notions of Brahmanical sociability. To keep the discussion brief, however, I focus here on what I consider the most telling articulation of antisocial dispositions, namely the king ascetic untouchable complex. Here are a few stray examples. The 13th century text, Shunya Purana, ascribed to Ramai Pandit, spoke of the god Dhamma, who, angry with the Brahmins for violently persecuting Buddhists, appeared on earth as a Muslim warrior and defeated the Brahmins. Until as late as the early 20th century, Dhamma, alternately called Shunya and iconized by an opaque black stone, was worshipped by the untouchable domes in Bengal. Again, the 16th century text Lakshmi Purana, attributed to Balaram Das, belonging to a devotional tradition of self-proclaimed Shudra ascetics, spoke of Lakshmi, the goddess of plenty, assuming the form of an outcast Chandala woman to teach her husband, the great Lord Jagannatha, a lesson in social equality. She forces him into penury and hunger till he ends up eating at the hands of a real-life untouchable woman. Since then, untouchables and Brahmins eat together in the god's royal abode, the Jagannatha temple in Puri. Yet again, the Shardula Karnavadanam, anthologized in the Divyavadana collection of early Buddhist legends, mention the learned Chandala king Trishanku, who knows astrology better than Brahmins. Buddha invokes Trishanku as exemplar of righteous law to justify his own act, that is Buddha's own act of initiating a Chandala woman, Prakriti, into monastic life. Drawing from this early legend, Rabindranath Tagore retold the story of the Chandala woman Prakriti and the Buddhist monk Ananda in his dance drama Chandalika, first performed in Bengal in 1933. Notice how these stories of the far past leave traces in our times. Also notice how these stories pair the king and the untouchable together via the mediation of an ascetic voice, sometimes ascribed to low-caste renouncers, sometimes to Buddha himself, who was, by the way, himself an untouchable in some of his previous births. In his controversial essay, Kingship and Untouchability, Declan Quigley posits the king and the untouchable as mirrors to each other. Both are ambiguously located vis-a-vis caste society, being simultaneously internal and external to it. Both tend to attract and absorb dosha, darkness, sin, corruption. The king, because calamities in his kingdom and the sins of his subject ultimately stop at his door, and also because he must undertake by necessity acts of violence and killing, and untouchable because he must deal with the discharges of society, dead bodies, carcasses, dirt, and waste. Both are potential threats to the social constitution. Both pay the Brahmin priest to take on, via ritual mechanisms, pollution onto themselves, freeing the king and the untouchable to carry on with their assigned tasks. Lest the king untouchable pairing appears to be merely an archaic historical fact, I quickly refer here to some contemporary ethnographies, which show modern day Dalits and quote-unquote tribals claiming the kingly prerogative. The first is Rosa Maria Perez's ethnography amongst the untouchable Vankars, Deres, and Meghavalas of Gujarat, who are called upon to make rain even today, based on the tradition that when a king failed in his royal task to ensure rain in his kingdom, untouchables must be mobilized to do so. The second is Kalpana Ram's ethnography of spirit possession amongst Dralith and tribal women of Tamil Nadu. These women, possessed by spirits of the untimely dead, perform as royalty, holding court, hearing petitions from all castes, and pronouncing judgments in classical oratorical Tamil, very different from their ordinary everyday speech. I feel that the Orientalist valorization of Brahmins as the repository of Hindu civilization, the colonial acknowledgement of the Dharma Shastras as the singular source of Hindu law, the military pacification of warrior communities and low caste lordships in the 19th and 18th centuries, and above all, the reformulation via population census and ethnographic survey of caste as a form of social demographics has emptied caste of political and kingly significance today. The late 19th, early 20th century phenomena of low and middle castes wearing the sacred thread and claiming the status of Brahmins was a direct consequence. This colonial modern turn of events has taken our attention away from the much longer history of Shudra and untouchables claiming warrior and kingly prerogatives as a way of short-circuiting the Dharma-based social constitution. This stake in Kshatriyahood rather than Brahminhood and in martial and lordly qualities, which was emphasized by Jyotiba Phule and invoked by many early 20th century Mahar activists in Bombay Presidency, cannot be understood in the framework of Sanskritization or social mobility by imitation of Brahmanical norms. It is better understood, I have suggested in this paper, in terms of the antisocial potentialities of the king untouchable there. Let me conclude by returning to the question of sovereignty. Now, historians from Sanjay Subramaniam to Wendy Doniger have noted that Arthashastra and Niti Shastra, the classical sciences of governance in South Asia, and the political narratives of the Mahabharata and the Panchatantra, picked up by Persianate kings in later centuries, have always been agnostic towards Brahmanical Dharma. This is indeed the case. But this does not imply that rulership in South Asia was or is in a relationship of sovereignty vis-a-vis the normative social order. On the contrary, in South Asia, the social order, as I have tried to suggest, is itself a juridicalized formation, a competing locus of power, relentlessly seeking to incorporate both kings and outsiders within its purview by ascribing to them a proper place in the Varna and Jati hierarchy. At times, political power would ride this incorporative social dynamic such that the king himself would operate as a social actor par excellence, as did not only the Brahmin Peshwas in Maharashtra, but also many big landholders For example, Raja Krishna Chandra in 18th century Bengal, and many others in the southeast of India. Perhaps we are seeing something similar in today's India, where the state seeks to make political identity and social identity, the nation and the Hindu, one and the same, allowing free play in its own name to punitive social forces, as when common citizens can come together to kill ordinary Muslims, invoking the eminently social matter of culinary choice. At other times, however, political power historically could and did push back against this incorporative social order, mobilizing a powerful antisocial perspective. This option, which we may call the option of exit, or the option to exercise the right to be outside society, is lost to us moderns. Our current vocabulary of majority and minority buys into the modern, sovereign, statist imagination of the dominant and the subaltern, arithmetically adding up to a single and seamless social aggregate without surplus, spillage, or remainder. There is no political vocabulary left today for the antisocial, the outsider, the foreigner as a locus of social critique. If, however, my proposition holds, namely that the king, the ascetic, and the untouchable come together in South Asian history as a single conceptual complex via the mobilization of an antisocial perspective, then kingship comes through here as an orientation potentially accessible to the subaltern, to those who are seen as outside the pale of society. Such a subaltern king, far from being a sovereign, inscrutable other, a transcendent and exclusive entity analogous to a monotheistic god as he was in the paradigm of European divine kingship from which the concept of sovereignty derives, such a subaltern king becomes a common entity, albeit potentially a powerful one. This is obviously shown by the phenomenon of insurgent kings thrown up in the 19th and early 20th centuries in course of innumerable peasant and tribal rebellions. When we study these rebellions purely sociologically, such as in terms of peasantry or tribals and so on and so forth, we miss out on their political aspects, most notably their kingly and their ascetic aspects, which were unmistakable. In the case of, for example, the much studied Santal and Munda insurgencies and the Sannyasi and the Fakir rebellions of colonial times. Needless to say, in order to fully understand the salience of kingship, asceticism, and the mode of being of the outcast, we as historians must break through the periodization boundaries and recover deep, though necessarily discontinuous, histories of political concepts and political subjectivities in South Asia. Such a task is, of course, easier said than done. What I have tried to do today, in arguably a very speculative way, is take some tentative steps, as it were, towards just such a historical time travel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prathama. Really, you put many complex things together. Really, really heads of you. Uh, I think you told us the genealogy of real sovereignty in Indian context, how people historically, maintained a particular, not particular, real sovereignty throughout the history. So, and I really like the idea of anti-social. I mean, how in history these protest groups, are seen as a kind of anti-social. But again, you said ki, these groups are again appropriated by the political, I mean, the state and ruling class. I mean, to put it more clearly, like what is happening in India and that. So then, what is the way out? I mean, if the anti-social is appropriated, then by the state, then how again the what is the way out from this? That's one. And I think I mean, to open up this for the discussion, I think definitely there would be a lot of questions from the participants. So participants can write their questions in the chat box. So you can read directly from them from the chat box. Otherwise, if you want me to read for you, I can also read it for you. And also participants can unmute themselves and ask the questions. So it's open for discussion. I mean, so you can start with my comments. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So, of course, if I knew the way out, I would be another person. But let me put it like this, that the very fact that the anti-national has become such a strong language of political disciplining tells us that the perspective of the outsider is in some ways a potential threat. And the perspective of the outsider, now in pre-modern times, you could indeed say that, yes, I am indeed an outsider. And precisely because I am an outsider, I can see the problems of society in perspective, and I have certain criticisms and solutions to offer. In the modern context, within the narrative of nationalism, an outsider is always already an enemy. So we have lost the right to actually say that, yes, I am an outsider. And therefore you must take me serious, because I can see in a perspective that you, who's an insider, cannot see. Now, my feeling is that many critiques of today's dominant and hegemonic political ideologies are effectively mobilizing the outsider paradigm. When the critique comes, even when a critique says that, yes, I am a citizen, I am a nationalist, and yet I can see by virtue of being different from you, the problems with the Indian situation today, they are mobilizing the outside perspective. It's just that right has been snatched away from us to actually celebrate the possibility of outsidership. I mean, the entire example, for instance, of the Sufi peers in Eastern Bengal is a story that I know a little better because I come from that part of the country. The entire discourse of peasant politics, peasant right, peasant piety, and peasant equality comes via the work of Muslim Sufi Pirs and Ghazis in Eastern Bengal. Right? So what we consider to be radical left discourse of equality today was a discourse that took as its basis a new outsider position and led to, in the 1930s, 40s in Bengal, a very rare moment of political radical alliance between the Namashudras and the Muslim Prajas, the untouchables and the Muslim peasants of Eastern Bengal, all on the ground of the outcast come outsider alliance. It was a really interesting and a greatly productive moment, which of course got completely suppressed by nationalism.
Okay, thank you, Prathama. Professor Aloka, now I think has.
I don't know. Would somebody else like to ask a question? Or
Yeah, you can ask now. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy that you've gone back to the far past. And for a change, a modern historian is looking so deeply at the material that we all have been discussing for a long time, the notion of the outsider and the outcast. The one thing, there are two things that I want to raise and maybe your reaction on that. So I've deeply read on and written on the notion of the mlecha, okay? The term itself has within it a wide variety of outsiders. So there's a kind of a heterogeneity in the way we use this term for different kinds of outsiders. Those that may have been maybe very well educated on the one hand, maybe wealthy, and on the other hand, extremely in a food gathering stage and so on and so forth. And similarly, if you use the word untouchable, when you're sort of problematizing the antisocial, I would probably like to think of the antisocial as also being absolutely heterogeneous. The Kapalikas, on the one hand, cannot be conflated with the Mlecha Muslims or the Shaka Mlechas or the Yavana Mlechas or whatever. And of course, there is this question of time as well. I mean, because you're talking about different. So going back to the far, I like this word far past. I mean, but you've really, really gone far past. It's not just simply the 13th, 14th century. So what I would like to posit over here is that I think that because of this heterogeneity, the so-called self, the Brahmanical self, the Dharma Shastric self, was in a continuous state of negotiation in time and in place. So that is like a kind of not a static notion of what we call the Dharma Shastric self. And therefore, the making of smritis, you didn't mention that because there is a continuous making of smritis. It's not as though there is only a single, the Manu Dharma Shastra or even the Yajnavalkya Smriti. And secondly, you have mentioned that the continuous making of the Puranas. So the Puranas, on the one hand, invoking a mode of narration that would enable this negotiation, and the Smritis also enabling this. So I would, probably extend your thing in terms of saying that there is the other or the outsider is not a singular outsider, that we must emphasize on that heterogeneity, because when the dominant self is trying to negotiate, it's doing this negotiation in a sort of very clever way, right? And that is why we have issues of dominance and right. That's the one part of it. And so maybe you wish to react on this, because this is something that, in my own work, which is of course for a very, very earlier period, I see phases in the way in which the mlecha outside is sometimes absolutely rejected, then accommodated with, and then incorporated. So it's like, you can see various phases of this. And the second point is about the ambiguous nature of the king and the untouchable. You said that the king, on the one hand, being not from the standard Kshatriya Varna, never existed, except for the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. There is the Ikshvaku, the end of the Ikshvakus and the so-called lineages everywhere in India. After that, from the Mauryas down to contemporary times, there is no pure Kshatriya ruler, right? So there's constantly the other. There is constantly the making of kingship from the outside. So there is no such thing as a Varna category of a Kshatriya, even in the earliest of the historical material that we have. So in this, if we argue from this point of view, what would you suggest would be the role of ideology, or if you want to put it, a role of religion? Because you mentioned that briefly, but I think that religion or a belief system is integral to the way in which the society is creating this ambiguity. No, so the social and the ideological combined, right? So the first about heterogeneity and the second about an integration of this ideological thing. I don't know whether I got across to you on these 2 points.
First of all, I want to say, Alokaji, I was very scared to give this talk, primarily because you were there. Because, because I am a modern historian, Anadhikar Charcha, trying to delve into like ancient history and medieval history. So I was very nervous, precisely because I knew you would be on the other side. But I have to say, I have profited enormously from your writings. I have not yet read everything that you have read, but I have read a great deal. And some of the things that you are saying are actually things that I have, that has made me think. For instance, the very idea that there is really no pure Kshatriya ever. It is always formed out of, Kshatriyas are in myth always killed off, and then new outsiders become Kshatriyas. That is actually at the heart of this idea when I'm saying that kingship is in some ways an externality that can break through the social hierarchy, and that kingship can be accessible to even so-called non-dominant groups, marginal groups and so forth. So that is where your argument is very much at the heart of what I tried to say. The point about heterogeneity is crucial. I actually left out a page or two from my paper because I thought I was overshooting the time, where I actually try to list the diversity of that outsider. So how many kinds of natures do we encounter in history? How many kinds of what we call today tribals is itself a very heterogeneous category. And so, but I skipped that part because I was getting late, but you were absolutely right. It has to be stated frontally that there is no one location called the outsider. I agree. Now, I am having grown up in modern Marxist historiography and thought about religion in primarily ideological terms. And today, in the way that we encounter religion in the public life, I do see as an ideological formation. But I think I have learned to understand religion at pre-modern times, before the operations of modernity and modern kinds of identity formation. I have come to understand what we call religion, that itself is probably not an exact term, as again, a very diverse category. Part of which is, of course, ideological, but part of it is also existential, aesthetic, philosophical. So I do want to bring on board the religion question, but I want to keep it more open. Again, something I'm learning. It's difficult because we have really ignored religion. All that we have said about religion is that it's ideology. So I want to move a little aside of that and understand the phenomenon of religion with a little more complexity. That's my immediate response in a way.
Okay, thank you, Prathama.
Maybe the word religion should be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Prathama, there is one question in the chat box by M.N. Rajesh. Can we agree with the idea of a colonialism? Can you see the question?
Should I see the question? Hang on.
Yeah.
Can we agree with the idea of colonialism producing Philip Ramirez's idea of ethnic indecision when it comes to the borderland communities like Chakmas, etc.? But, okay. At the same time, the Chakma royalty were veering towards Shastric ideas and incorporated. Correct, yeah. In this category. Yes, I actually would agree with what Rajesh is saying. That in some ways, it is true that I think many historians talk about the 17th and 18th century as, and I'm still reading about it, I'm not clear, but 17th and the 18th century, the immediately pre-colonial times, as a moment when we see a certain kind of Brahminization in what we call Eastern India and quote unquote Northeast India. And the reason is, I think, again, I may be wrong in it, Rajesh, but as far as I understand, it is because there is a kind of triangular contest between what Indrani Chatterjee has called monastic governmentality, the kind of regimes of earlier monastery-based rule, the quote-unquote forest kingships, and Islam. It is in this general map that, in some senses, colonialism arrives, with its own anti-Islam and statist discourse, leading to a kind of Sanskritization of both kingships and social identities in the late 18th, early 19th century onwards. I think it's a tentative answer, but I think, Rajesh, that's what I would say.
Okay. Prathama, there is another question in the chat box by Sridhar Mudugu. Can you respond to it?
Okay. Similar to Jacques Legoff's Saint and Outcast of Medieval Europe, following Professor Sen's inputs, ideology, religion through control recognition. Okay. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, I agree with the latter part of the statement that you make, Sridhar, entirely. You are right. From 12th century onwards, the phenomenon of subaltern saints proliferating constantly is a very real phenomenon. And in fact, this continues to happen in the 19th century, as late as that. And we must really take this very seriously, therefore. Because we think of Indian religions in the modern times as primarily based on textual sources like the Vedas or the Dharma Shastras or whatever, or even philosophical texts, we actually do not seriously look at the embodied figure of the saint, except some very big ones. I mean, very big saints are written about, but this phenomenon of constant proliferation of saints is something very, very seriously to be considered. Now, the European story of the saint and the outcast, I think, is quite different from the South Asian story. for the obvious reason that in Europe, there is the church, the other sovereign power, with whom in competition the state's sovereignty emerges in some ways. And sainthood is always something that the church negotiates. Often saints are killed, often saints are beatified by the Catholic Church. With Protestantism, the phenomenon of sainthood is in some senses abolished, at least, even though saints do keep proliferating all over the place. So that's a very strong distinction. So the church, the Inquisition, the Catholic Protestant movement, the Reformation movement, these make the story quite different. Also, what we have in South Asia is what I'm calling a social constitution, which is not reducible to a religious stroke ideological formation. It is a constitution which manages people's social relations with each other in terms of whom you can eat with, whom you can touch, whom you can pass by in the street. That's a different story. That's a different imagination of society whatsoever. And therefore, the outcast, of course, the problem is of the English language. Very often, when we use the term saint or we use the term outcast, it seems like the same thing. But if we look at the vernaculars, I think the difference will become more pronounced.
Okay, thank you. Vaibhav, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is that we were talking about a certain impasse or impossibility of exit when it comes to the modern times. So in that regard, I want to ask, how do you see Ambedkar's decision to exit Hindu non-society, which he declared in 1935-36, and after 20 years of intense reflection, eventually performed that exit in 56 by reinventing Buddhism. And so how do you see that exit? And a second question, how do you see the nature of that exit vis-a-vis the pre-modern antisocial exits, so to say, which you spoke about?
Oh, I am absolutely, that exactly is what is in my mind when I write a paper like that. The paper actually, the subtext of the paper is indeed Ambedkar. I do quote him at some point. The fact that at the end of everything, at the end of talking about social reform, at the end of trying to create a sovereign state and a sovereign law which will fight social inequality, he, at the end of the day, is forced to step out and claim the position of the outsider. And his debate with Gandhi from much earlier times, throughout the 1930s, and the debate around conversion. Gandhi, for instance, says very clearly that he doesn't support conversion. He says that the religion you are born into is like your nationality. It's your destiny, right? And so in other words, Gandhi is saying that there are certain ways in which you cannot step out. At the end of the day, Ambedkar steps out, and he steps out not lightly. After a lot of efforts at mobilizing the constitution, mobilizing state law, politics, elections, and so on and so forth. So I think that very phenomenon, in some senses, fuels what I'm trying to argue here. And the fact is that Ambedkar actually studied many of the historical texts that we are talking about here, especially the Smriti tradition, and of course Pali and Sanskrit Buddhist text in translation, in order to recover the possibility of this stepping out, right? He could have converted. I mean, there's a lot of debate on why he converted to Buddhism and not to other. And there many things can be said about that. Some of it might be pragmatic reasoning, but at the end of the day, I think it is crucial that he chooses an ascetic tradition or a historically ascetic tradition, because it allows that outsider perspective, which other religions do not in some ways, or other philosophies do not.
Okay.
Bhankya, can I ask a question?
Yes, Varghese, please.
Thank you, Professor Prathama. I'm also perhaps sharing the anxiety that has been expressed by Bhankya and Vaibhav, because this idea of incorporated social order that you are actually suggesting is slightly scary in the sense because of its the underlying pessimism, right? Where you said that there is no space left for antisocial, foreigner, and the outsider. So I'm just wondering, are we left with no space for politics of hope? Because you're actually speaking about the spiritual position of Dalit women, etc. in Tamil Nadu. And my example comes from Kerala, the case of Mada Amrudanandamai, where a Dalit woman touching everyone and hugging everyone, right, against the normative untouchability. In some sense, she's subverting the normative, but of course, many of her devotees consider her as a Brahmin herself. But the point is, there is some subversion. So my question is, how do you see these contestations within the incorporated social? Do you see it as real and perhaps potential enough for a politics of hope?
Well, again, it's a big and profound question, Varghese. I do not know what I can say. I think as academics, the least we can do is recover the hopeful potentialities that lie in these phenomena. Now, all that I'm arguing here is that subversion by itself might not lead to a better future. Along with subversion, an extrapolation of possibility of new ideas, new languages, new idioms, I think is what we need to recover. Now, I was talking of this particular ethnography by Kalpana of Tamil women's spirit possession. What I found extraordinary about that ethnography is not the fact per se of subversion, because this phenomenon is pretty common in many parts of India, where at particular moments in the year, the untouchable is allowed center stage, and the untouchable is allowed a voice, the right to touch others, the right to speak out, the right to criticize, and is also given a kind of preeminent or a priority place in processions, in festive moments, and such like. There are many instances of this phenomenon. What Kalpana Ram's ethnography shows is that one, this is not an exceptional carnivalesque moment, as it were. It can happen anytime, because spirit possession can happen anytime. And the spirits that possess these women are again spirits of other ordinary women. But that existential connection with the dead that happens allows the woman to become a king. And for that length of time, an ordinary poor woman of Tamil Nadu village, her language changes, her body language changes. And so Kalpana Ram also studies cinema, Tamil cinema alongside, and Malayali martial arts and dance forms alongside, to actually look at body language and the language of gestures, as it were, and show the performance of royalty through these various other aspects. Now, that I found to be really captivating. The fact that this unexpected possibility can occur, which I think is more than subversion. What it requires is us to read the possibility of subaltern kingship in this, which we do not, because in our mind, kingship is, of course, an archaic form, and we live in a democracy. And talking about kings would appear to be reactionary or anachronistic. Right? I'm trying to recover the possibility that kingship might have meaning in today's times, in today's politics. If not, then why would so many important theater personalities, right, and radical theater personalities stage plays on kings? Girish Karnad, Vijay Tendulkar, Habib Tanvi. The king is an important political figure to understand politics even today, is the kind of implicit argument I'm trying to make. Sorry, I just went on for too long.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just make a small point?
Sure.
Okay.
One thing is that, not directly related, but when we go back into historical examples, the antisocial, whoever is the outsider who becomes the king, then becomes the spokesman for a kind of a dharmic society, establishment of Varnashma Dharma. I have two examples, actual historical data about the Shakas of Western India who become rulers, who put in place Sanskrit as the language, give land and villages to Brahmins, and advocate the establishment of a Varna Dharma society. And in coastal Andhra, in Andhra Pradesh, the other day I was telling Bangaya also, you have the Boyas, an autochthonous tribe that referred to as Boya Kula Brahmins, actually. Priests of the Boyas become Boya Kula Brahmins, and there are inscriptions referring to them, and they have coterms and they having. So what I'm trying to suggest is that when you suggest that the antisocial is this sort of site for resistance and sort of questioning established order, once the antisocial has succeeded, then it can become the articulator of asserting that similar mode of no. So I think that dialectical relationship also should be, because the same thing would happen in a contemporary situation. I don't have examples from.
Okay.
Okay, Prathama, there is two more questions from chat box, lengthy questions. Can you go in the or this is a layman's query.
Shall I read the question?
Yeah.
For everybody?
Yes.
Okay. In context of dynastic rule, sovereignty is a concept that we often come across in context of epics such as Ashwamedha, whereof the supreme power of the Chakravarti is militarily consolidated. But it involved the subjugation of external territorial entities, leading to the formation of Samanta relations. As far as the fringe elements, based on Varna classification, they retain their own clan structure, but remain subsumed to central power structure. When it comes to the historical context of Kerala, 12th century, a mythical king Mahabali, yes, was actually conceived from the subaltern classes, quite so, to take on the dominant Hindu social structure. Apart from dynastic rule, did feudal relations play any role in the processes? Okay. Well, I mean, I'm not sure I'll use the term feudal relations, because that has been such a controversial, and again, that has a kind of European resonance. And I don't want to go into the older debate about whether there was feudalism in India or not. But yes, you could say that a kind of duplication of relationships of dominance and subordination could happen at various levels, from the largest king to the smaller kings, to the smaller kings, etc., to the kind of local landholders and such like. But the very fact that in Indian history, the repeated oscillation between large integrated kingdoms and a return to small local or regional kingdoms is almost a kind of a constant through Indian history, shows that there is no permanent large imperial formation. It always breaks up by the reassertion of sovereign, counter sovereignty powers at other levels, including on the fringes of society. And of course, the epics have very, very important references to these figures of Ekalavya, the ascetic, the Shudra ascetic, Mahabali, so many others, the Kirata king. So I think there is much to be recovered from the kind of from these repressed layers of mainstream texts as well. And many scholars are doing that today. So the Mahabali story is very, very important as part of that treasure house of alternative voices, alternative stories, available within the dominant text, as it were. Quite.
Madam, may I intervene?
Sure. Sure.
Madam, I was particularly fascinated by this story behind the formation of kingships, especially in the context of that Mahabali story. Because in Kerala, a whole season of festivity has been formed around this Mahabali, that is Onam. You know that?
Yeah, I know.
Actually, it is centered around the story from Hinduism itself, where Vishnu, you know all these things, how Vishnu just put his feet over all these things you know. But actually, it was appropriated by Buddhism for a myth creation, so that an ideal figure of a king could be conceived out of the lower classes. Because in that particular 12th century, it was during the period of when Buddhism was trying to spread itself across the masses in Kerala, the lower classes in Kerala, and as a result, this story was distorted. The real mythological interpretation was distorted in order to create an alternate historiography. This is the actuality behind Onam.
Okay.
And that is why this creation of kingship, a kind of myth creation, is actually constituting the whole process of social formation. This is what I wanted to state.
Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah. There is another question, Prathama, by Abir Majumdar.
Abir Majumdar, yeah.
Yeah. Can you?
Alternate historical imagination of a majoritarian sect seems to have become the notion of the sovereign. It has subsumed any and all secularist purports or imports by besmirching their role in historical existence of the sovereign republic. It seems to be that the people have actually taken up the work of driving a sect or more sects towards a zone of exception. Yeah, sure. I mean, I see that many of you, and me included, are actually thinking from our contemporary and feeling that many alternative imaginations are being pushed out into a kind of what you are calling a zone of exception. I agree at one level, except that I will not be so quick to use terms such as secularist or exception in a kind of longer historical context. Because the story that I'm trying to say is neither a secular story nor a non-secular story. In fact, it kind of gets constricted if we read it through the modern day secularism, communalism perspective. Right? I think we will have to, if we have to really break out of the modern day dead ends of political debate, we will have to find these other imaginations and also recognize that the limits of our modern vocabulary. So that's, but overall, I agree. I understand and I agree with what you're saying. Absolutely.
Okay, okay, thank you. So I think we'll close it here. We just, is there any question? Yeah, I think we'll close it here. Thank you so much, Prathama. Vijay, are you there? Vijay Ramdas.
Yeah, Bangya, I'm here, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Can you make a formal vote of thanks?
Okay, thank you, Professor Prathama Banerjee. It's a quite, illuminating talk on the notion of sovereignty. I think even in the context of European history, there were, outcast groups always challenged, like, Stuart England. But in India, we have a different trajectory of history. This is something fascinated me as well, because I'm also studying about tribal resistance in the central provinces as a form of, creating an intellectual narratives of the Baigar tribes, Gonds, other than what Professor Bangya had written in his book. So it's very, very fascinating talk on the plurality of the sovereignty, the notion of the outsider. Thank you everyone for also richly enriching through questions on the talk of Professor Prathama Banerjee. I hope to read your article if it gets published, and thank you very much. Your first book and this particular talk is altogether different. I think you almost appeared like a Professor Tapur or Aloka Parashar in today's talk.
I am very flattered.
Yeah.
I'm very flattered.
Thank you. So thank you once and all. Yeah.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
We are very happy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor.
Modern historians are going. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, we are trying to occupy your territory.
Yes.
No territory, no territory. There's deep history, this question of time and continuities. This is very important.
No,
whatever
we have to
Prathama has been doing in her earlier work. I've been telling you this, Bangya, I've been telling you this for a long time.
Yeah.